What's up, everybody? Okay, so I was trying to address several comments in this video, but what Lawrence is bringing up here is a very deep subject, and I don't take this lightly. It's very important to a lot of people. I started with the New Testament and didn't really even get around to the Old Testament because it's really not my intention to mess with anybody's faith, especially anyone new to Christianity, but I am just telling you what I think of things. Just addressing this took up a whole video here, so I guess I'll put out a couple of videos addressing some of these comments, which I should probably do more often, but I gotta tell you, you really have to suit up in your armor to go into your own comment section, because it only takes one a-hole to completely ruin your day. Making videos is a creative process, much like songwriting or poetry, and you kind of pour your mind and soul into these videos. And you're really putting yourself out there, which leaves you in a bit of a vulnerable spot, especially with controversial subjects. And sure, some days you feel strong and you got your armor on and you can take on the world, but then there's other times, like recently, I'm always struggling with one level of depression or another, and lately I've been at about an 8, and it really only takes one comment to completely ruin your day, which has happened more times than I can count. When you're feeling strong, then you're walking around angry for the rest of the day. When you're not, when you're kind of depressed, then it crushes you and you feel like an ant all day. While I truly appreciate the nice, uplifting comments, unfortunately, it's just part of the human condition that one negativity can outweigh hundreds of positives. So until you've put yourself in that position, I don't think you understand what it's like, but that's why most creators stay out of their own comment sections. And I'll just tell you, I used to interact with the comment sections more than any other creator that I know. But it's oftentimes hard to armor up for whatever is going to be thrown at you. And finally, I took Joe Rogan's advice. He said, man, I don't read anything that's written about me because that is the safest route. I'm just a human. And for every video I make, there are 20 keyboard experts out there telling me I'm wrong about this, wrong about that. But for some reason, they haven't put any material out. So that's the way that works. But even though I am feeling kind of down lately, I did brave the comments sections, and I'm going to answer some of these. When honestly, the last few weeks, I've had to force myself to talk and make videos because I'm just like, who wants to listen to me? So, Lawrence, I'm going to do my best to clarify what I mean by things here. And I guess I'll start by saying I'm skeptical of anyone using spirituality or God to gain secular power here on earth. And that is what has happened with the story of Jesus. The Church of Rome has had a monopoly on that ever since 100 years after it happened. Now, I grew up Christian, and unfortunately, I no longer have the blind faith that the preacher testifies to. I went to church, up until my teenage years, did my own thing for a while, and then started going back to church in my 20s because of a girl mainly. But while I was there, of course, I'm going to try to get closer to God. I've always been a very spiritual person. And then, how the preacher tells you to come up front and let Jesus enter your heart. Did that several times over. And I still felt hollow and empty and life was pointless. Once again, that's just part of the human condition. We are disconnected from source at the moment. And to be honest, my studies into Buddhist philosophy has helped me more with that than anything else. I guess I'm doing the long version here today, so get comfortable. So look, I've studied the history of Christianity pretty in depth. I've read not all the Bible, but most of the Bible. And by analyzing the text on my own, that's where I came to the conclusion that, hey, this Old Testament God can't be the father of Jesus. These are just two diametrically opposed philosophies here. Well, as it turns out, Marcion, who was the first person to ever compile a Bible, looked at the story of Jesus and looked at the story of the Old Testament God and said, no, there's no way that this fits together. And I'll go into some of the specifics about the Old Testament God, Yahweh. And to be honest, I don't even like talking about this to people that aren't already secure in what they believe, in their own faith. But just understand up front, I'm not saying anything negative about Jesus. I personally think that he was either one, God incarnate, or two, sent as an emissary of the true God, which you could say is the Son of God, or three, reached some type of enlightenment where he had with direct conscious contact with God. But he appears to have been born somewhat spiritually evolved because, according to the Bible, he was contemplating and arguing deep spiritual concepts with the priests from a young age. Now, just throwing out different ideas there is sacrilege according to Christianity, but here's what I see in that. They take one line out of the Bible, John 3:16, "For he so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, and whoever believeth in him shall have everlasting life." Combine that with the Immaculate Conception, and that's what Christianity means. Okay, well, I've read the New Testament. Tell me where it says in there that Jesus says, "You need to worship me." He never says that, but churchianity takes verses like this: "I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me," and says, see, you have to worship Jesus to get to the Father. And then the Catholics have completely bastardized this into, well, the only way to communicate with the Father is through the Pope. He is our divine regent here on earth. Now, while there are good men and women who believe in God in that church, the church itself is an organization bent on secular power. To keep this short, there is a lot more that I disagree with the Church of Rome, the Catholics, than with Protestantism. But back to this particular verse, I see this as meaning, look, I've come down in a human meat suit and walked a mile in your shoes, and I've shown you how to do this. I understand life is hard and full of suffering and torment, but you can still be a good person and turn the other cheek when it's that time. But I also think that the church has turned Jesus into a complete pacifist when he was more rebellious than anything, especially towards the law of Moses, the Old Testament. But what I see here is that preachers have taken a line here and a line there that they prefer and built Christianity on the, quote, inerrant word of God. But here's the deal. I'm sure Jesus did drop some pretty memorable quotes, but this was all word of mouth for the first 45 to 60 years, and I think it was 300 years before the entire New Testament was compiled. So this would be like going up to a group of people right now that heard Martin Luther King Jr. give his speech back in the 60s and then took off to the mountains and hasn't read or seen any video clips for the last 60 years on this and asking them what Martin Luther King Jr. said. Probably all of them are going to say, yeah, he said, I have a dream. And then one of them is going to say that men will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And then another one's going to say, no, he said he was going to get rid of oppression in Mississippi. And then another one's going to say, no, he said he was going to get rid of that arist governor of Alabama. So they're all kind of right, but nobody's quite got it verbatim what he said. So I'm sorry, but I am a bit of a realist about things. And I understand that the original Christianity was a bunch of word of mouth, and it was 40 years or more before the first Gospels were even written. Now, I think what happened there caused shockwaves all across the Mediterranean, and word spreads like wildfire. There was international shipping at the time. People talk, word spread fast before the internet, trust me. So different sects of Christianity were already forming before anything was ever written down. And then even after things were written down, look at the early history of the church and the Council of Nicaea and the Arian heresy, the Marcion heresy. Those are just heresies because the Church of Rome won. So I think parts of the Bible are direct quotes because they were so memorable that everybody did remember the same thing. But that a lot of it was left up to the authors of the Gospels to fill in the blanks and write what made the most sense after that. So to take another example, Jesus and the adulteress, I'm sure everybody remembered him saying, let he who is innocent cast the first stone, which I'm going to use for my next jumping off spot. So let's wrap up that train of thought. I don't think Jesus's intention was ever for anyone to worship him. He always gave glory to the Father. And that what preachers use as a direct quote from Jesus may or may not be what he actually said. So when you isolate one verse and hang your hat on it, I think you're taking away from the big picture of what Jesus was trying to teach. They even asked him, what is the greatest commandment in the law? He's talking about the law of Moses, which we're getting to. He says you should love the Father, and we're going to differentiate between the term Lord from the New Testament to the Old Testament. Love the Father with all your heart and all your soul. It's the first and great commandment. And the second is love thy neighbor as thyself. On these two commandments hang all the laws of the prophets. Meaning, if you understand and practice these two things, then the law is actually irrelevant. So now let's talk about the law of Moses and Jesus's thoughts on the law of Moses. The Pharisees and Sadducees were constantly trying to trip Jesus up on the law and get him to directly break it. Only he was very clever. So one day he was teaching in a synagogue on the Sabbath. And to clarify, the Pharisees are the priests of the law of Moses and his followers, the Grays, I usually say, the YHWHians. And the Pharisees were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus. So there was a man with a shriveled hand, and they went up to him and said, hey, go up front and see if he'll heal you, because you're not allowed to do any work on the Sabbath. Jesus knew what was going on. He looks around and he says, well, I ask you, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to destroy it? So he healed the man's hands, and now the Pharisees are furious. One gospel says they started to discuss what they could do about Jesus. The other says they started plotting to off him. In one gospel, he says, is it right to do good or evil on the Sabbath? And in this one, he uses the example, if any of you had a sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, would you not lift it up out of the hole? Basically, anytime Jesus was confronted with the law of Moses, he found a workaround for it. The Pharisees finally figured they had him worked into a corner on this one, and they brought an adulteress in. Now, according to the law, an adulteress is to be stoned all the way. So they bring her in front of Jesus and says, well, okay, teacher, tell us what to do about this. And he's just sitting there drawing in the dirt, kind of ignoring them. And they're over there snickering, saying, well, he's either got to say to stone her or he's breaking the law. And he just says, okay, let he who is without sin cast the first stone. And there's a whole crowd around ready to see this, mob mentality and everything, and just took the wind right out of their sails. So one by one, they start walking away. So my advice to Lawrence, anybody else in this position, anybody new to Christianity, I invite you to read the New Testament. And I think what you'll find is every time that Jesus is confronted with the law of Moses, he treats it as a harsh, barbaric doctrine. And when directly confronted about it for not showing the proper reverence for the prophets, he says something to the effect of this, and no, I don't think any of this is a direct quote, but got the gist of it. And he is talking directly to the YHWHians, the Grays here. If God were your father, you would love me, for I have come from God. I have not come on my own. God sent me. Why is my language not clear to you? Because you are unable to hear what I say. You belong to your father, the devil, and want to carry out your father's desires. He was a red rummer from the beginning, not holding to the truth, for there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks his native language, for he is a liar and the father of lies. Yet because I tell the truth, you don't believe me. See, they're still trying to convict him of breaking the laws of Moses, and he says, can any of you prove me guilty of a sin? If I am telling the truth, why don't you believe me? Whoever belongs to God hears what God says. The reasons you do not hear is that you do not belong to God. So whether a direct quote or not, I think the sentiment is there that Jesus is saying that the God of the Old Testament is not the Father that he is speaking of. So now I'm going to list some of the reasons that I think this way. But I openly admit that I could be wrong here, and I've only thought this way for a few years. The way I see it, a truly benevolent God isn't going to fault you for asking questions and for seeking knowledge. Only deceivers want to keep you in the dark and tell you just believe what I told you to believe and don't question it. That's the approach that mainstream media has taken lately, and it appears that they're getting their butts handed to them right now. Now, I had recorded that whole previous section, and then I opened up Studio, and let me show you a little bit about how this works from the creator side. When you open up the Studio app, down at the bottom, you'll have the most recent 3 comments. So a lot of times it is completely random what I actually see. So when I just opened Studio, I saw this comment from Crazy with Sanity. I'm not sure what this symbol right here means yet. That's kind of a new thing. And she says, if Jesus was celebrating the Passover at the Last Supper, why would he celebrate the Passover if it was by an evil God? Good question, and something I'll probably think about for a while. But my initial thoughts on that is that he was obeying the laws of the land, and the laws of the land were the laws of Moses, also Roman law. He was careful to not actually break any laws, but teach a better way. Another time that the Pharisees tried to get him caught up, they asked, what is your opinion? Is it right to pay the imperial tax to Caesar or not? According to Roman law, you were to worship Caesar as a god. And this is why YHWHians were a notorious thorn in the side of the Romans. The first of the 10 commandments is, you shall have no other gods before me. So they thought they had him trapped in a damned if you do, damned if you don't. So if he says, yes, you should pay this tax, then you're putting Caesar, a mortal living God, in front of the true God, the way they see it. And if you say no, then you're breaking Roman law. Then he has to answer to the Roman authorities. So he knows their evil intent and says, you hypocrites, why are you trying to trap me? Show me the coin that's used for paying the tax. And when they brought it to him, it was a denarius, and he said, whose image is on here? They said, Caesar's. And he said, so give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. So he was careful not to break Roman law and not to break Moses' law. The whole time the Pharisees were trying to get him to break Moses' law, he was careful not to. Now we view these laws as religious guidelines instead of the law of the land, but at the time it was the law of the land that you would be punished for, like getting a DUI today. So not celebrating Passover was breaking the law at the time. And then I'll add this in. He says, he broke the bread and says, take and eat. This is my body. It doesn't specify whether or not he ate the bread. Then he took a cup of wine and told his disciples, drink from it, all of you. This is my blood of the covenant. This is the new covenant. And here it does specify that he didn't drink. He said, I will not drink from the fruit of the vine until the day that I drink it with you in my Father's kingdom. So I could make the argument here that he didn't actually celebrate the Passover. But to be perfectly honest, that's not the strongest argument. So let's just go ahead and go to the strongest argument I know against what I'm saying of the Old Testament God not being the Father of Jesus. Here he says, drink this wine. This is representative of my blood in a new covenant. Now, I don't memorize what verse is what verse, but in another spot he says, do not think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I've come not to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Now, to me, this has always been one of the strongest arguments that Jesus is saying that Yahweh is the Father. Now, all things considered, who were the people that wrote the Gospels? Well, according to scholarly consensus, all 4 of them were written by YHWHian authors, who, in my opinion, aren't always the most fair and unbiased purveyors of truth, especially if it's regarding anyone that's not YHWHian compared to a YHWHian. Do we need to get into the Talmud here, where it says in a court of law, if a gray brings a non-gray into the courtroom, that you're to find for the gray? I'm not going to dig to find that, but it's a thing. So I am going to point out that this was written by people that will always stand up for the tribe before all others. You're not allowed to point that out because then you're Semitophobic, but trust me, I could go on. But even as the text is written, I've come not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. Well, to fulfill something is to bring to completion or reality, achieve or realize, or to carry out a task or duty as required. So once again, I am just telling my own personal opinion. I am no authority on anything, but I see this as Jesus coming to earth to pay a blood debt. And if he's paying off a debt, then who's he paying it to? Did his Father demand a payment from mankind for all sin and then send himself back to pay that debt? Or did some of mankind swear an oath to some other entity the Hebrews and their covenant with Yahweh, and Jesus came to free them from their obligations by paying their debt. So, for one thing, this was written by people whose first loyalty is to the law of Moses. It's not that I don't trust Jesus, it's that I don't trust man. And I kind of see this as turning on CNN to find out what Trump said in a speech. You're going to get things out of context and totally biased one direction. So that is a consideration, but taking the text at face value, the way I see it is he's saying, I'm not even going to try to abolish the law. The law is going to be here until heaven and earth disappear. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands and teaches others accordingly will be called the least in heaven. Okay, that would be me if I'm wrong about this, but let's finish out this train of thought here. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, let's look at what the law actually is. Here's the 10 Commandments. Now, Yahweh is a self-proclaimed jealous God, so the first 3 commandments are about him. The 4th is about keeping his holy day. And then you get into morality. And yeah, you shouldn't off anybody, you shouldn't steal, you shouldn't sleep around. And these are actually just the base level moral principles, especially if you compare this against other religions of the time. I mean, Hinduism and Buddhism was around. But to me, this doesn't necessarily mean this is coming from a loving God that just wants the best for you. A prison warden sets out rules for the inmates too. It's not because he loves them, it's because he doesn't want to riot. And if you read the Old Testament, they were actually quite barbaric at that time. So really, these are just the most base level laws to keep peace in a society. And Jesus says, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the law, you're not going to see the kingdom of heaven. And then he starts breaking them down one by one. You've heard it said that you shouldn't red rum, but I tell you that if you're angry with a brother or sister, then you're subject to judgment. And then you've heard it said you should not commit adultery, but I tell you, if you lust after a woman, you've already committed adultery in your heart. He keeps going through all of them saying, look, you've got the very most base level of this. So now, circling back to the beginning, anyone who sets aside the least of these commands and teaches others accordingly will be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. And unless your righteousness surpasses that, then you're certainly not going to the kingdom of heaven. So, like I said earlier, this is the strongest argument that I know of that Jesus indeed is referring to Yahweh of the Old Testament as the Father. So, for one, all 4 of the Gospels were written by people that would have a very good motive for leaving some things out or even outright lying about what was said. And I'm going to tread lightly here and just leave it at that. But even taking this at face value, I see this as Jesus saying, yeah, those commandments are the very basic level of this, and you need to do much better. So, like I said, I'm going for the hardest part here. This is the best evidence I have against my own argument here because I'm just being honest with you guys. I'm not selling anything. I'm just telling you how I feel about things. I don't claim to be an expert or an authority on anything. But this is the one part of the Bible where I've constantly second-guessed myself about everything I'm saying here. And I'm showing it to you guys just for full disclosure. And I'm just going to leave it right here for now. And then I'll get back around to this and I'll show you my best evidence for why I think that Yahweh of the Old Testament is not the Father that Jesus is talking about. So to Lawrence and anybody else in that boat, I'm not trying to tell you what to believe. I want you to believe what you believe. In my opinion, go with Jesus at all times. But if you want to hear my counter argument to what I was just presenting and why I think that Yahweh of the Old Testament is not the Father of Jesus, then check out my playlist here. I know it's 21 videos. I'll try to get a video out and kind of compress things down. A lot of those videos aren't even mine. It's other people that have came to the same conclusions that I have. But of my videos, you might start here and just understand this is an ongoing investigation. And I have my reasons for saying this, but right now you'd have a hard time convincing me that Yahweh and Jesus are on the same side of things. Just one of the strongest arguments here is this. maybe the cleanest and straight to the point, is that Christians say that the person that comes and builds the third temple is the Antichrist. The Grays say that the person that comes and builds the third temple is their Messiah because they don't believe that Jesus was the Messiah. So how is it that the builder of the third temple can be the Antichrist and the Messiah and be the same person and everybody's on the same side? Anyway, it's a very long, deep subject, and all I can do is break it off into chunks here. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. I'll catch you on the next one. Static out.